Good evening, friends. Today we celebrate All Saints' Day, and this evening we'll chant and meditate and talk a bit about the saints, and particularly those connected with our path. And so let's begin now with a prayer together. Pray silently or out loud as you feel to. Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, beloved friend, God, great masters of self-realization, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahasaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar Ji, beloved Guru Paramhansa Yogananda Ji, all saints and sages of all nations and all religions, lovingly we bow at thy feet. Divine Mother, we are thine. Naughty or good, we are thy children. Receive us on thy lap of infinity, of infinite joy, infinite freedom. Make us one with thee. Om Shanti, 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 Shanti. So we'll begin with a chant written by Swami Kriyananda now. He wrote it in Italian. We'll sing the English words. Quanto ti amaro, how shall I love thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe, just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desires. How shall I seek thee, how shall I serve thee, and how shall I worship thee, are the other verses. How shall I love thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? How shall I love thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? Just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desire. Just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desire. How shall I seek thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? How shall I seek thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? Just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desire. Just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desire. How shall I serve thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? How shall I serve thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? Just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desire. Just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desire. How shall I worship thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? How shall I worship thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? Just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desire. Just as a fire may burn a whole forest, burn to the root my desire. How shall I love thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? How shall I love thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? How shall I love thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe? How shall I love thee, Lord my God, with every breath I breathe?
Now we'll have some stories, and Dharmadas will move the camera over so you can see me a little better. And I'm going to be talking about St. Francis, who is probably the most loved saint around the world of any of the saints, the most well-known, revered even by people in religions that don't have saints. St. Francis even has garden statues in gardens all over the world. And this beloved saint there are just so many, many stories about him, but tonight I will focus on a few of them. He was born in 1182, and there had been rumblings from saints who lived before him about a new energy coming into the Catholic Church. And Francis was that new energy. He gave a new spirit of joy to religion. He brought that beautiful imitation of Christ into being. He wanted to be like Christ. He wanted to live in his footsteps. When St. Francis was being born, his mother, Donna Pica, was having a terrible time with labor. And she was told, this child can't be born in this rich and fancy house. Go to the stable, and there you'll be able to give birth. So she was carried to the stable, and in the humble surroundings of the stable, she was able to give birth to Francis. She was French, and her husband, Pietro Bernardone, was Italian. And Francis grew up, his real name was Giovanni, but his manners and his way of speaking were so French that his companions nicknamed him Francesco, and that nickname is what stuck. So Francis grew up as the life of the party, and because his family was wealthy, his father was a wealthy merchant in cloth, he always had money to spend, and he was always lavishing this money on his friends, paying for all the rounds of drinks and all the rich foods and all the parties. And he was a troubadour. He would sing joyful songs and regale his friends with his gaiety. And of course, when he was old enough to start working in his father's shop, then he drew in lots of customers and was always there with a ready joke and a warm smile and just very friendly and very magnetic. So when he was about 17, I think, the city of Assisi, where he lived, went to war with the neighboring city of Perugia, not very far away by today's standards. We can drive there very easily between the two cities, but in those days it was a long way by horse, and they had gotten into some disagreement, and so dressed in the finest cloth from his father's shop and with the best sword and the best horse and all decked out, Francis went to war. And not very long after, maybe a day or something, maybe even the first few hours, he was captured because playing swords with his friends was not the same as fighting in a real war. And he languished in prison for some time, over a year. And even in prison, he still cheered his fellow inmates. He was still that troubadour of trying to keep things positive, trying to keep things joyful. And after some time in prison, he was released, and he came home only to be stricken by this very mysterious illness. He had delirium and fevers for many, many months, and really it was a time of the dark night of the soul for him. He couldn't recognize people. People would be talking to him. He couldn't hear them or see them. And finally, what started to break through for him was the light of the sun. And he got to the point where during the day, when he could see the sun, then he could hear and see other people because they were standing in the light of the sun. But then at night, he would go into these fevered dreams. And eventually, he got over this, but he still had this love and reverence for the sun. And as he was getting well, he decided that there was another war happening, this time with the overlords of the area. And so the wealthy burghers of the town were going to raise an army and fight against these overlords. So he had a dream, and he dreamt that he was in his father's shop, which was very familiar to him, all the rows of shelving and all of that. But instead of cloth, there were swords and shields, and each shield had a cross on it. And he heard this voice saying, "Someday all of this will belong to you and your warriors." And Francis thought, okay, well, when he woke up, he thought, okay, I guess I'm going to be a great knight, so I'm going to go, I think it was to Spoleto in Italy. He was going to ride there. And he was on his way when he was, again, unexpectedly stricken by this fever. And as he was making his way back, after he had recovered, he saw a leper coming towards him on the road. And lepers in those days were reviled and shunned, and they had to wear special clothing. They had to have a bell that would announce their arrival. And because it's a skin rotting disease, there's a terrible stench that goes with it in severe cases. And so Francis was just disgusted. He just was appalled at this sight, but he decided no. He would not distance himself. He would not give in to his disgust. And so he approached the leper, and he took the leper's hand and kissed it. And the hand was hardly recognizable. It was just a mass of boils. And as he did this, he felt a wave of happiness through his entire being. And in that moment, he was released from any thought of disgust, any thought of separation from suffering humanity. And after he left the leper, he probably gave him some food or something, I don't remember, but he got back on his horse and he turned to wave goodbye to the leper. But the leper had disappeared. And the road was open. There were no trees, there was nowhere for him to have gone. Plus he was moving very slowly because he was so stricken. But he had disappeared. So Francis went back. He lived his life. He was still trying to help his father in the shop. But he went every day to the colony of lepers. And he tended to them as best he could, brought them food. But more than anything, he tried to give them the elixir of joy. And he changed their lives. And they were the first people who ever called him Saint Francis. Well, he was, as I say, working in his father's shop, and one day a beggar came, and Francis didn't have anything to give him right then, and he was engaged with customers. And so the next time he looked over to give this beggar attention, he couldn't find him. And so he left the stall that was out in a marketplace at this point, not the actual store, and he followed and tried to find this beggar and give him something. Well, he did, and then when he got back, his father was furious because he had left the shop unattended. And it just grew worse and worse with his father until finally his father took him to court and called his own son a thief and demanded that he paid a certain amount of money for whatever he had taken to give to the poor. And Francis, in this full courtroom, just said, not only will I give him the money he has given me, but everything I've had of him I give. No longer will I call Pietro Bernardone my father. I wish to only say, my Father who art in heaven. And he took off all of his rich garments and clothed only in a shirt of hair, which is what many saints have worn under their clothing, so that they're always irritated. Their skin is always irritated because they're wearing this hair shirt, just as tapasya, as penance. So he was only wearing this, and he gave everything to his father. And the bishop was so moved by his display of devotion to God that he took off his bishop's cloak and he crossed the courtroom and he put the cloak around Francis. And his father just didn't show any emotion. He just picked up all this stuff and left. And you never hear about him reconciling. Who knows? I think when Francis became famous, he was probably secretly proud of him again. I hope so. And I hope that they did reconcile. So then Francis left home and just lived in the woods. And he was perfectly happy because he had given up a human home for God's home, a home without walls, a home without anyone to dissuade him from living totally for God, trusting totally in God. And he had told a friend who was joking with him before the trial happened, he was saying to Francis, "You're so quiet. Are you contemplating marriage?" And Francis just spoke out of the fullness of his heart. He hadn't premeditated this, but he said, "I am going to be married to the most beautiful bride in the world, Lady Poverty." And his friend didn't know what to make of that. But what Francis wanted to do was live totally for God, trusting in God for all of his needs, all of his food, his clothing, his well-being, everything. And about this time, he had gone to the little chapel of San Damiano, and he had felt Christ say to him, "Rebuild my house for me, restore my house for me." And so he set about that task, and he would beg for stones and mortar and everything he needed for building. And people did donate, and he would beg for his food. And he received a lot of derision for his begging. He was laughed at. The door was slammed in his face. People chewed him out for being a bad son and being a beggar, and every time, even if he seethed for a moment inside, he would bring himself to say, "Thank you for the abasement. I needed the humility, the lesson in humility." And he just was steadfast in his decision to live for God alone. And even when he finished the San Damiano church, and the priest there was wanting to pay him, or at least to let him live there and share the food that this priest had, Francis said, "No, you keep your food for yourself. I don't want to be paid." And that was a theme throughout his life. He just did not want any payment. And so after a time, he decided to preach. And he went into Assisi to preach this life of joy, this way of being with other people in God. And at first they threw things at him, they laughed at him, they derided him, but he kept going. And he would quote the Bible, "Give what you have to the poor, leave everything and come follow me." And one by one, the rich man sold all of his land, his rich houses, his horses, his everything. And he and Francis gave it all away to the poor. And they lived together. And soon a canon of the church followed Francis. And they lived in dire straits. They had a little shed that they had found, and even though it was leaky and cold, Francis drew with charcoal, or I think it was charcoal, on the floor, so that each person had his own little space, and they were very respectful. They tried to stay within their little chalk line, just so that they would all fit in this tiny little shed. And finally, a farmer came in and said, "Get out of here, I need this for my donkey or my cow or something." And so they knew it was no more theirs than his, so they let him have it. And after they got to be 12 people, and he had sent them out 2 by 2 to the 4 corners of the earth to preach, or the 4 corners of Italy probably at that time, and because they were starving, they had nothing to eat, and they were just out in the woods, so he sent them out preaching. And then at a certain time, mentally, he had an inspiration, and he called them all back, and they came to the Porziuncola at that time. They came all there within a few hours of each other. They had all received that mental thought from Francis. And he decided to go to the Pope and receive permission to start this new order. And so they all went to Rome, and it was Pope Innocent III at that point. And so Pope Innocent was dressed in these rich ermine robes, with the bishops all in scarlet, and in a papal palace. And it was a very sort of church and state mixed together. The Vatican was very political in its dealings at that time. And one of the cardinals met with Francis, let him stay with him, and the other brothers were all there too. And this one cardinal believed in Francis and believed that they were doing a good thing. And all the other ones just scoffed. They didn't think any of it was of any merit whatsoever. And the Pope himself was torn. He didn't know, he could feel all the pressure of the church needing to change somehow, needing to grow and expand, but he was very involved in the politics, and he didn't know what the answer was. So Francis met with the Pope and all the cardinals, and it didn't go that well. Finally, Pope Innocent just said, "Well, let's break for now, and we'll listen to the opinions of the other cardinals. And that night, and then come back tomorrow." And that night, Francis could hardly sleep. And when he did sleep, he had a dream that he saw a very tall tree. And as he reached up his hands to this tree, the top of the tree came down, it bent to him. A strange dream. And that same night, Pope Innocent III had a dream as well. And his dream was that he was walking on the terrace of his palace, and he saw that this great basilica, that it's the most grand and beautiful basilica in all of Christendom. It was a very important basilica at that time, right near his palace, starting to rock and shake, and it started to fall. This great basilica. And just then, in his dream, Pope Innocent saw this ragged man in just tatters run to where it was falling, and he lifted up the corner of the basilica and held it on his shoulders. And in his dream, Pope Innocent sighed with relief. Oh, thank God, we've saved the church. And just then, the little ragged man turned his face to Pope Innocent, and he saw that it was Francis. So all of the cardinals had come to their decision, and they told the Pope that it was just ridiculous what this man wanted to do. He didn't want to have any sort of land. He didn't want to own any abbey or any place for his monks to live. They were going to beg for their food. It just didn't seem practical. And why would anyone want to live that way? They should just be like the Benedictines or some of these other orders that had land and orchards and grapes and all these things to survive. And so they were telling this to Francis, to Pope Innocent, and he was deciding against Francis. And then Francis just broke into this parable. He didn't premeditate it at all. He just said, there was a woman who lived out in the countryside, and one day the king came by, and he was so enamored of this woman that he forgot his kingdom, and he married her, and she had many sons with this king. And then he remembered his kingdom, and he left her and went back to being the king. And her many sons grew up, and when they got to be young men, she told them, go to the king. He is your father, and he will give you anything that you need. And so the young men went to the king, and the king saw that they all looked like him. They were his sons. He remembered the woman, and he provided for these young men and got them started in life. And so no one in the room could understand this parable. What was Francis talking about? They just thought he was crazy. And then Francis explained, I am that woman, and God has blessed me. And now I'm coming to God's representative, and I want your help in caring for my sons, my spiritual children. And because the story, the parable, was so out of the ordinary, it got Pope Innocent to think out of the ordinary, to remember his dream from the night before. And he stood up and gave his decree that you have my blessings. Go and do the work that God has given you to do. And so Francis had left Assisi with shouts of derision following him, but he came back with a papal order allowing him to do this work. Can I go on? So I'll just tell a few more stories. Well, I think Francis is best known for some of the beautiful stories with animals. There was a time that he was crossing a river to get to the other side, obviously, to go into another town. And a fisherman who was also ferrying people across this river gave Francis a fish to eat. a live fish that he had just caught. And Francis said, "Is this mine to do with as I wish?" And the man said, "Yes, of course." Francis put it right back in the water. And the fish was so amazed and touched by being in the hands of this saint that the fish stayed close to the boat and watched Francis the whole time that the boat crossed the river. And the fish stayed there close to the shore and waited. And when Francis came back in the boat, the fish followed him to the other shore. Similarly, there was another time when Francis was given a bird, a partridge or a pheasant, to eat. And the bird was captured and given to Francis's hands. And again, Francis said, "Is this mine to do with as I wish?" And the man said, "Of course, it's your gift. I'm giving it to you." And Francis let it go free. And the bird came down and sat right next to him and wouldn't leave his side. Another time, he was going to meditate and have seclusion in Lago Trasimeno. There's Isola Minore, the small island, and Isola Maggiore, the large island. He was going to Maggiore, and no one else was there. So he went to have his seclusion and meditation, and he noticed when he got up from meditation that there was a little rabbit sitting right next to him very quietly. And every time he came to meditate, the little rabbit would sit right next to him very quietly. But he was his companion the entire time he was there in seclusion. And of course, there's the famous story of the wolf of Gubbio. Gubbio is a town in Italy. And this wolf was a terror. He was terrorizing the townspeople. I don't know if he actually killed people, but he was certainly killing their sheep and all the animals that they were trying to husband there. And so as Francis was walking one day towards Gubbio, he saw this angry group of farmers and all decked out with spears and pitchforks and swords and whatever they could find. They were going to find this wolf and kill it. And they knew where its lair was, and they were on their way to the lair, and they were going to destroy this wolf. And so Francis said, "Well, let me come with you." And as they got closer, he said, "Now, let me go first. Let me go to the lair and just see if I can work with this wolf." And they said, "Oh, don't do it. He's dangerous. He'll kill you." And he said, "Well, just please give me just a few minutes." And so he did go to the lair, and the wolf was there, and the wolf came out. And Francis said, "Brother Wolf, why are you living like this? You don't have to be so angry and full of hate." And he just went on in this vein, just talking to the wolf. And the wolf hung his head. And Francis came nearer to him, and he held out his hand. And he said, "I promise you, you will have enough to eat. Just don't raid the farmers' herds. Just live in peace from now on. And the wolf put his paw in Francis's hand. And he looked up at Francis lovingly, adoringly, and he followed Francis like a dog right back to this angry mob that was just standing there with their mouths open now. They couldn't believe what they had just seen happen. And the wolf sat by Francis, looking up at him, and Francis talked to this mob and said, just feed the wolf and he won't bother you anymore. Well, the wolf became the town mascot. He was everywhere, and children would play with him. He was a totally changed animal. And so there are many, many, many stories of St. Francis, but I think I've given you enough for one time. And now I will turn this over to Dharmadas, and he'll tell you another story about a great saint. Already up.
So I will talk a little bit also about Francis, but and just by way of filling in a little bit more in the present day, we both lived in Assisi and were very blessed to be around the energy of Francis, and the power of his devotion and magnetism and spiritual presence is very evident still, even all these years later. In fact, in some ways, I think it might even be stronger because it's had all these centuries, and by no means is Assisi only about Saint Francis. I mean, there's Saint Clare and there's Saint Joseph of Cupertino, who lived in Assisi for many years, and anyway, there are a number of other saints. There were a number of other saints even alive during Francis's life. The Saint Anthony of Padua, who originally came from a different country, but lived the rest of his life in Assisi in a different order. Actually, he was from a different monastic order, but he became part of Francis's order and went out preaching. And so there's this power in that town. And I remember when I lived there in the 1980s, when it came time for me to shift back to America, the very last day going up on Monte Subasio, the mountain above Assisi, and I could just feel this power permeating the whole area. And a story that Nirmala didn't tell, but toward the end of Francis's life, as he was leaving Assisi to go back down the hill to Bastia, to the Portiuncula area where they were sort of based down there, he had them, he was blind by this time, but he had them turn him to face Assisi. Even though he couldn't see Assisi, he could at least face it, and he gave it a blessing to Assisi at that time. And I am convinced that that blessing is still there to be felt, because certainly over many years now, starting in the 1980s and again in the 90s and again many times since then, we've traveled there and we always feel this blessing going there. And so Ananda has a work outside of Assisi, and we would often take pilgrimages into Assisi. But there's just such a sweetness there. Swamiji himself was meditating in the Portiuncula, the little chapel near where the monks were stationed down there in Bastia, just down the hill from Assisi, just about 2 or 3 miles away. And at one point he said, I felt such sweetness, more than I could conceive of. And he asked in prayer, how is such sweetness possible? And the answer came by never judging anyone, by giving all the love of God. And so Swamiji wrote many songs related to St. Francis, and even put to music the Canticle of the Creatures that Francis wrote toward the end of his life. He felt such inspiration that he just burst out in song. Kind of a segue to that story Nirmala was telling at the beginning about how the sun was this transforming power for Francis when he had been ill, and how he could see people and relate to them when he was out in the sun, but then when the sun would go down, the illness would sort of overtake him. But it's like that blessing came to Francis again as joy, and so the song relates to Brother Sun and Sister Moon. I'll just sing a very little bit of it. It's not written with any musical accompaniment, but Altissimo, omnipotente, buon Signore, tue son le lode, la gloria et l'onore, et ogni benedizione, a te solo se confanno, et nullomo è degno de terminate. Francis wrote what became the first poem in the Italian language, and got a little bit of sort of concern from his brothers singing in that language, because it was considered a little bit common. The language of spirituality was Latin, and which of course was the language of the educated, those who could read and write. But that's the way the Spirit came to him. That's the way the song and the way the blessing came to him. And so he related to people at that level. And Yogananda passed through Assisi in 1935 on his way to India, and felt Francis and Christ's presence there. He walked in those same places. And so there is a connection on some level. Yogananda called Francis one of our line, and in fact he used the phrase, Francis is my patron saint. And there's some connection there, some profound connection. But I've always been inspired and impressed at how Francis could just relate to people as they were. And he never wanted all the trappings of his position. In fact, even the term saint, which people very freely applied to him while he was alive, which is, of course, very uncommon in the Catholic tradition, and really in any of the Western spiritual traditions. You don't call a saint while to their face. It's almost like it's considered bad luck or something, like they might veer off into the woods or something with their lives. But it was commonly known that here was a very great and special soul. I remember we've taken pilgrimage groups around Italy, and we've also, within Italy, when we lived there, we would take pilgrimages, sometimes day trips, like up to La Verna, where Francis took seclusion and where he received the stigmata. And the little cell where he would stay, Christ would appear to him, not just in vision, but in physical form, and sit on this table. And that table is still in the cell. Nowadays it's covered with glass, but in those days, in the 1980s, when I lived there, it was just there, and you could go in and meditate. And I remember meditating there at lunch one day, and you could just put your hands right on that table. And I tell you, there was a power there. It was unmistakable. And the centuries did not diminish it. So these things are very real. And I'll just close my little bit of this, and then I think we'll sing another chant or two, by saying that we are, all of us, potential saints. And I remember in the early 1980s, Haridas had formed a little group of us monks, and the group was called the Future Saints of America. And I remember, for all of us, young men in our 20s and maybe the oldest ones at the advanced age of 30 or something, but all of us, that thought was sort of far off. Yeah, future saints, whatever. But we were very dedicated, and we were very devoted and very inspired in a fiery way to live the life of dedication to God. And that is what a saint is. A saint is one dedicated and devoted. And they may get a spiritual name, and they may take vows as part of a spiritual tradition. They may live an unusual life away from the common civilization, away from the usual ways of life, or not. God plants his saints in strange places. That's a line from, I believe, the levitating saint that Yogananda described in Autobiography of a Yogi. That saint basically never came out of his house. He would sometimes, on a special religious holiday, he would come all the way to the sidewalk outside the front door of his house. But otherwise he was indoors. Very unusual, but that's the life that God gave him to lead. And so for all of us, let us, with hearts open, wide open, and deep devotion, find the path that God is giving us to lead, and live it with full dedication. And so we'll sing a chant now. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do seek. And just feel the bliss of that life of dedication and devotion to God. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do seek. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do seek. In the thought by my love brought, in the thought by my love brought, I taste thy name, so sweet, so sweet. Devotee knows how sweet you are. Devotee knows how sweet you are. He knows when you let go. He knows when you let go. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art how sweet you are. Devotee knows how sweet you are. He knows whom you let know. He knows whom you let know. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do see. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do see. In the thought by mind of God, in the thought by mind of God, I taste thy name, so sweet, so sweet. Devotee knows how sweet you are. Devotee knows how sweet you are. He knows whom you let know. He knows whom you let know. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do see. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do see. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do see. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do see. Thou art my life, thou art my love, thou art the sweetness which I do see.
Meditate briefly, and then we'll have one more chant. So I'll sing a chant, and I won't do proper justice to the story behind the chant because it would take a bit of time to tell the story, but
You should still tell the story.
well, okay. The the chant is Swami Ram Tirtha's chant, and this is a chant that Yogananda included in his book Cosmic Chants, and it has this unique character, this incredible power, and yet in some ways I think the spirit of this saint, Ramtirtha, was similar to Francis. He was very simple. He was he taught math when he was making a living, but then he can you flip that thing around? Then he had the inspiration and felt to devote his life to God. He traveled to America. he traveled back to India. His life was relatively short. I think he only lived to be about 40. And he just had this spirit of connecting with God through nature, connecting with the power and blessing of God. And for him, it's a little bit picks up what Nirmala was describing as the freedom that Francis felt in a life completely dedicated to God. It's like he had given up this fancy home, but he had taken up a mansion of infinity. So it didn't matter to him that he lived in the woods. It didn't matter that he had to beg for food or whatever. And Ram Tirtha had nothing. Once he became a Swami and dedicated his life to God, he had nothing at all but whatever God gave him, which was enough for him. And so this chant has, I mean, the words are a little shocking because there's real power in it and there's real energy and magnetism. And so, anyway, enjoy. There's too many words for me to say them all, but I will say, the refrain, none can atone me, say, who would injure me, can also be said, none can tone me, like none can tone me down. But it's absolute dependence on God is the spirit behind the chant. None can atone me, say, who would injure me? None can atone me, say, who would injure me? The world turns aside to make room for me. The world turns aside to make room for me. I come, O blazing light, the shadows must flee. I come, O blazing light, the shadows must flee. Hail, O ye oceans, divide up and part. Hail, O ye oceans, divide up and part. Or parched up and scorched up, be dried up, depart. Or parched up and scorched up, be dried up, depart. None can atone me, say, who would injure me? None can atone me, say, who would injure me? Beware, O ye mountains, stand not in my way. Beware, O ye mountains, stand not in my way. Your ribs will be shattered and tattered today. Your ribs will be shattered and tattered today. Friends and counselors, pray waste not your breath. Friends and counselors, pray waste not your breath. Take up my orders, devour up ye death. Take up my orders, devour up ye death. None can atone me, say, who would injure me? None can atone me, say, who would injure me? I ride on the tempest, astride on the gale. I ride on the tempest, astride on the gale. My gun is the lightning, my shots never fail. My gun is the lightning, my shots never fail. I chase as a huntsman, I eat as I seize. I chase as a huntsman, I eat as I seize. The trees and the mountains, the land and the seas. The trees and the mountains, the land and the seas. None can atone me, say, who would injure me? None can atone me, say, who would injure me? I hitch to my chariot the fates and the gods. I hitch to my chariot the fates and the gods. In the voice of thunder proclaim it abroad. In the voice of thunder proclaim it abroad. Howl, O ye winds, blow, bugles, blow free. Howl, O ye winds, blow, bugles, blow free. Liberty, 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 oh. Liberty, 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 oh. None can atone me, say, who would injure me. None can atone me, say, who would injure me. Liberty, liberty, liberty. Liberty, liberty, liberty. Liberty, liberty, liberty. Liberty, liberty, liberty.
So let us draw inspiration from the lives of these great saints and realize that our destiny is also to have the level of dedication and devotion to God that they have. We have that potential, as Dharmadas was saying, in ourselves. The potential to show the kind of humility and love that St. Francis had for miserable humanity. He kissed the hand of that leper. Let us open our hearts more to people, to give more of God's love to everyone that we meet. So let us make God the pole star of our lives.
I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are bright. Though my sea is dark and my stars are bright. Still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are bright. Though my sea is dark and my stars are bright. Still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are bright. Though my sea is dark and my stars are bright. Still I see the path through thy
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And let's let the light of the saints guide and inspire us and help us in our lives.
God bless you all.